Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are going to be exploring the work of Rav Shlomo Wahrman, an obscure and perhaps underappreciated Gadol and Talmud Chacham, who is living in our midst right here. I'm saying right here, being in the Northeast area and formerly from Long Island. And joined with us today is Rabbi Eli Slomnicki, who is a distinguished educator and leader in Jewish education, grew up in West Hempstead, and attended HANC, Hebrew Academy of Nassau County. Rabbi Slomnicki received his smicha from Landers and has an extensive experience as a teacher and administrator after serving in several yeshiva high schools. Currently, he serves as the menahel, the principal of HANC High School, guiding students and faculty with dedication and vision. Rabbi Slomnicki resides in Great Neck with his wife Alyssa and their 5 children. And most notably, for the purposes of our episode, he spent 6 formative years learning in different capacities with Rav Shlomo Wahrman, Zichrono Livracha, who is the subject of our episode today. Generally, we focus more on what you might call the cheftza, the actual tshuvos, the documents that are produced, but we're going to use it more as a hechi timsa, a means to talk about the gavra, the individual Rav Shlomo Wahrman, who I suspect, perhaps like myself, many have not yet heard about, or if they have, they don't yet have the appreciation that they really should. And again, if you have heard, I'm not insulting our listeners, I'm speaking for myself as an Am Haaretz. Now, Rav Shlomo Wahrman, and we'll hear more about him in just a moment, was a rebbe and actually Rosh Yeshiva at HANC. And my wife's family, actually, they are all HANC graduates. I served actually at the Young Israel Plainview for 2 years as well, which worked out nicely because I got to spend Shabbosim with the in-laws. It was a pretty good deal. And I've heard Rav Wahrman's name brought up in passing. And it happens to be upon coincidence, or perhaps actually hashgacha pratis. I was at a used Sfarim sale, and I happened upon several volumes of his magnum opus, She'eris Yosef. And I was so captivated by the profound level of erudition and Torah scholarship, which is, perhaps we could talk about this. It goes beyond what one might expect from a typical high school rebbe or even a pulpit rabbi. And I was so captivated by it that I just had to learn more. And so this brings us to Rabbi Eli Slomnicki, who not only was a Talmud for many years of Rav Wahrman, but also now serves as the menahel of HANC, which is a school that Rav Wahrman was teaching at. So for all these reasons combined, I can't think of a better person to have on than Rabbi Eli Slomnicki. I thank you for your time, and I think our listeners are in for a real treat today. Perhaps we can start before even, I know you chose, we're going to look as a sample at a tshuva of his about women saying Kaddish for their parents. But before we even get into the halachic minutia, maybe just if we could spend a few minutes for those of us who aren't familiar, or even for those like myself who have heard of him, who was Rav Shlomo Wahrman, Zichrono Livracha?
Right. So growing up in West Hempstead, going to HANC, like we definitely took for granted at some level, the greatness that was in our midst. But Rav Wahrman would often talk about his life. It's like we kind of knew who he was. That he was born in Leipzig, Germany, to a Polish family. He wrote a book, Lest We Forget, where he goes through kind of what that meant in pre-Holocaust, Poland and Germany. Leipzig is in Germany, of course. But he moved to America before the war, and I think initially he was in Cincinnati for a decade or more, which is where he interacted with his rebbe, who he often talked about, Rav Lazer Silver. He often would talk about him. My understanding, I believe he came to New York to Torah V'das for yeshiva as high school age. And ultimately settled in, I think initially Bayswater, because I remember some West Hempstead chevra saying, like Mr. Joel Phillips, Oliver Shalom, used to talk about I believe how he knew Rav Wahrman from his Bayswater days.
Wow, that's where I grew up.
Oh, interesting.
I grew up going to Young Israel, Wavecrest and Bayswater. Obviously, I probably did not exist in this world at the time that he was there.
I think if you look in I think it could be even in the Chelik Rishon of Sheir Yosef. I think his address is listed at Bayswater, but if you look at the later editions and the Oros, you'll see his Kew Gardens Hills address. That's the home that we would often visit. And he was a rebbe in HANC. He was a rebbe / Rosh Yeshiva in HANC. And that's a pretty rough sketch of kind of his bio that I know.
So I looked at the few volumes I was able to get my hands on, and I was just amazed at the haskamos, the approbations that were on the book. There is a glowing haskama from Rav Moshe Feinstein, which is right at the beginning. But then also, if I recall correctly, there's Rav Avadia, I believe, is on there. I think Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is on there as well as some others who are also worthy of mention, but escape me at the moment. So
I'll
he
tell you an
seemed
interesting anecdote. I recall when in high school, again, why Rav Wahrman thought we even cared, about this following detail. But in hindsight, it's so interesting. I recall Rav Wahrman telling us when he was publishing Oros HaShabbos, I was a junior or senior, so this is 96 or 97, almost like we were going to ask the following shaila, and he bevorn kasha, and he bevorn the kasha. He said, I'm printing Rav Moshe's Haskama in 97, right? Rav Moshe was not alive, obviously, right? So he was bevorning the kasha. How can he reprint the Haskama of Rav Moshe, right? Rav Moshe is no longer, on his Oros HaShabbos, he's no longer alive. I don't remember who he quoted, but I remember him telling us, I'm able to do it because I asked this shaila, and and this, whoever his rebbe was, said it was mutter to reprint Rav Moshe's Haskama, which I think may have ended in Chelik Beis. He had a fresh Haskama for Chelik Beis, but that was an interesting anecdote that I remember.
Yeah, and what also kind of just amazed me about him as I was touring through and cruising through the Sefer is that, so first of all, he seems to kind of, I mean, again, who am I? I'm upper Tachas Reglei. I can't start doing Gadol ratings and saying like who's an A tier, who's a B tier, but clearly he had the respect of what we would consider to be the first rate Gedolei Torah. And just reading from his own Chidushim, he was on a very high madrega. He knew a lot. And in fact, if I remember correctly, back in the day where I would binge, every now and then I listen to it still, but I would binge Rabbi Ari Leibitz's Temin Halacha. So I think a while back, one of them I heard was about whether, there's a whole question about the propriety of scheduling siyumim during the 9 days as a means so everyone can eat meat. So that's a sugya into itself. But assuming all the right details are in place and conditions are in place to legitimately make a siyum and a sudas mitzvah during the 9 days, there's a question: what if a woman is making a siyum? Could that siyum count enough to constitute a sudas mitzvah for these purposes? And I haven't seen it inside. Maybe I don't own that volume. I only have 3 out of, I think, 6 or maybe more. So apparently he said yes. And Rabbi Leibowitz quoted Rav Shechter, who was quoting the Sheris Yosef. So I would just like, whoa, the Sheris Yosef is like being quoted as halacha lemaisa, which I think brings me to another question, which is, I know you mentioned he published several works. Sheris Yosef's one I'm most intimately familiar with, but this seems to be, some of it is like Chidushei Torah. A lot of it perhaps is Chidushei Torah. For instance, I was just reading a piece. He had a small little piece because I just finished going through Mishnai Zvachim. He had a piece on, the status of Mishkan Shiloh, which was really interesting. That obviously has, unfortunately today, Bavonoseno Rabba has very little halacha lemaisa practical import. But he seems to have, and I think this brings us to his piece on women reciting Kaddish, he has what we would almost call like shuvos. Like he's actually addressing not just a theoretical case about the Beis HaMikdash, but he seems to be right, not just in the abstract, but does he want people to walk away with a practical takeaway? Like what should we make of his writings in that respect?
So again, I guess I'm the Menahel of HANC, so I'm in this seat today. There are Talmidei Chachamim who know Rav Wahrman's Torah much better than I. But if you're asking me the question, we never got the sense that Rav Wahrman viewed himself as a posek. He did sit out in the RCA based in. He did talk about those times to us in Shir. He did, but we never got the sense that he viewed himself that way. Although it is true that in some of the pieces of She'eris Yosef and or the different Oros series, it's written as a tshuva, as the one we'll learn today. But if you when you knew him, it's not the stature position that he kind of presented himself with. He presented himself like a rebbe, like Rosh Hashiva might not be the right word given that it was HANC, but he presented himself as a rebbe. But maybe I didn't have the right exposure to him, meaning maybe there were, other Rabbanim who viewed him. If you read, we'll talk about it maybe, Rabbi Daniel Feldman has a beautiful piece online. You can find it, almost a reflection on Rav Wahrman. He talks about it when he was a young pulpit rabbi, how he would go to Rav Wahrman and discuss communal kind of halachic issues.
Wow. So he's just really this gem of a Talmud Chacham who I guess this really begs the question for people like me who only discovered him in recent years, for someone of his stature, and the fact that other rabbis went to him for guidance, just why haven't more people heard of Rav Wahrman? Is it his humility, his modesty? Does it have to do with the community that he was in? Do you have any sense of why an Adam Gadol like this just wouldn't be as widely renowned? Like, did Ami Mishpacha decide not to write something up, and that's why? Is that how it works? I think it's
That's
a broader
actually
question about who becomes a Gadol. I mean,
right.
there's a broader sugya over here.
It's a great question. Again, we had the sense, even as high school kids, that we were, in the presence of greatness. And I think we even asked ourselves the question, with all due respect to the school we were in, like, why is he here? And, people had talked about how he was offered to be the Rosh Hashiva in different places. He definitely had relationships with large yeshiva gedolos, like Yeshiva University. I remember there was a rumor about Karen B'Yavne. Um, it could very well be, you mentioned his humility. He did not hold kind of this large communal post in Kew Garden Hills. I don't know that he was ever a Rav in a shul. Again, he sat on the based in, at RCA. He used to talk about Rav Willig and his time together. He used to talk about those moments. He had this very charming way about him. Um, it could be due to his humility. It would be hard for me to conjecture, but there definitely was a lot of humility.
Mm-hmm. And something interesting is just that he seemed to occupy this kind of, what they like to say nowadays, they call a liminal space between the modern Orthodox and more yeshivish Welt. He seemed to, again, you look at those Haskamos, clearly had the respect of what you call like the mainstream Haredi Gedolim. But here he is working at HANC, which I'm sure you could probably speak about this better, that even as co-ed mono-Orthodox schools go, I think HANC kind of, you brand yourself more of a yeshiva in that respect. But it's interesting. I wonder almost, if that had something to do with it, the fact that he wasn't neatly within any particular community almost.
It's actually it's an amazing ha'ara, in the sense that I think for many of us who felt close to Rav Wahrman when we were in HANC, when we left call them the Kosle HaYeshiva, and we went to the different yeshivos that we were in, Yeshiva Gadol, whatever, different Yeshiva Gadolos, at least I'll talk about myself. I reflected back and I said to myself, here the world is kind of like, categorized, but you can't put Rav Wahrman in a category. Here he was the Rosh Hashiva of our day school. He did teach in a Talmud Torah. We'd been in his home many times. We would go to his home on Chol HaMoed, alumni, even when we were in high school, Mekabel Pnei Rabo, Barega, we would do that. I believe he even has a piece in one of his Sorim about that. And there was a plaque on his walls in the living room or the hallway about, I think it was Mid-Island Mid-Island JCC, something like that, where he taught in the Talmud Torah for many years, which I think is kind of how he may have gotten to HANC, or I'm not exactly sure the timeline there. And then I reflected back, we used to go to his home, to his sukkah, and the sukkah had Israeli flags. That was part of the noise sukkah. And he talked about Rav Lazer Silver, and he talked about the, call it what your language mainstream, Gadol Torah, whatever you want to call. But he never had that kind of definitional aspect to him. He was just a Wahrman who loved his Talmidim and who taught us Torah, B'Ahava. Like that was very much in hindsight kind of who he was. He definitely didn't limit himself in that way.
Right. He wasn't Rodei Vachar Kavod. He wasn't looking for, being in a position of srara and authority over others. And those are, I always say those are like Moshe Rabbeinu. Those are the people, halavai, that we should be elevating to the highest of positions, after the ones who aren't looking for it. So, okay, I'm sure Rav Wahrman would probably appreciate if we actually learned some of his Torah. I'm sure that's what he would want from us. So I know you chose Chelik Bey's Siman Samech, which is not just an abstract Hidushei Torah, but actually it's a question of women reciting Kaddish, which, I think in the yeshiva shavelt, in yeshiva world, that's pasnish. There's like not even a havamina really for a woman to be saying Kaddish. But I guess this kind of speaks to the position and community that he was a part of, that this was even a shaila that would come to his desk in the first place. So maybe you could just share with us how he addressed that question.
So even before, as I do that, just reflecting back on, the piece that you mentioned through Rabbi Leibowitz's 10-minute Torah, I think it's the same volume, Chelik Beis, I think it's from 1981, that the issue of a woman making a siyum during the 9 days, and would a man be allowed to partake, eat meat, in that siyum, that's in the same.
I have to look more carefully at the table of contents then.
Yeah, I think it's the same one I was reviewing last night, and yeah, it's definitely a testament to to I think the world that he lived in and the exposure that he had, which maybe in other communities he wasn't, because even in this siman about Amiras Kaddish al Yidei Bas, so he writes Nishalti Imroi Shabbos Tomer Kaddish Beis HaKnesses. He was asked this question, like it was real, for him. It's almost reasonable to assume that a student asked him such a question. And interestingly, even just as a prelude to this, and just again by way of learning more about who Rav Wahrman was. So again, I was in high school in the mid-90s, so in the time of Torah tapes, and you recall that the headliners, Rabbi Beryl Wine and Rabbi Yisachar Frand. And one of I think the moments where we learned that Rav Wahrman wasn't just our high school rebbe, wasn't just the Rosh Yeshiva of HANC, but he was someone on the Torah scene. I remember hearing through the grapevine, maybe it was at Teen Minyan on Shabbos through the older guys, that Rabbi Frand quoted Rav Wahrman on one of his Torah tapes about this issue of a woman saying Kaddish.
Oh, wow.
And that was, again, the 90s, that was like a big thing, at least for us who were, so to speak, in the know or wanted to be in the know. I think that gave, you'll excuse the phrase, but it gave us at HANC a lot of street cred. This is our Rebbe who's being quoted by my friend on the Torah tapes.
That's what I heard. I heard at Maimonides. I don't know if this is true. What I was told is Maimonides, where Soloveitchik was the Maradas, were there, like sports games. I don't know if they still do this. They say, they chant, "We've got the Rav. We've got the Rav." So I assume you felt like a similar kind of pride in knowing oh, wow, this isn't just like our Rebbe. He's Torah celebrity over here in that respect.
Yeah. You definitely meet a HANC graduate, and that'll be a point of pride for them, 100%.
Wow.
So he sort of Wahrman, which is atypical for his Svarim. His Svarim really are Chidushei Torah, but peppered in them are kind of more tshuva style pieces. This being one of those. And he was asked, is it appropriate for a woman to say Kaddish? He quotes the Sefer Chavas Yair, which is again, I think oft quoted in this sugya at this point, what it is, 40 something years later. The person who died didn't have any sons, and he hired 10 men to learn, so that his daughter could say the Kaddish after. in that Sefer Chavashor, that Yesh Lochush Aidei Kach Yichalshu Koach HaMinhagim Shel Bnei Yisrael, there was concern, this will be an erosion, if you will, of Minhag Yisrael, which doesn't have, at least until that point, women saying Kaddish. He quotes that. He goes on to quote the Shilas Chuvas Chuva Me'ava, that again, not that there was this moment where young girls were saying Kaddish, girls of 5 or 6, that there was this concept that there had been this, I guess, some element of precedent of females saying Kaddish. He clarifies, if you will, that it seems that in that, from that scenario that the Tshuva Mi'ava quotes, that it's really only in the Azara of the Beis HaKnesses that you would be matir, meaning not in the Beis HaKnesses proper, that it would be proper for those young girls to be saying Kaddish, but seemingly not in the shul proper. He quotes the Mate Ephraim, and a similar kind of scenario to Misha in lo banim rak bas, someone who doesn't have any sons but only a daughter. But tziva lifnei p'tirasa shilamdu asara bevesam b'scharam. He hires post-mortem. He hires 10 men to learn in his house. V'achar limo tomer abbas kaddish. That in such a scenario, the Mate Ephraim says ein lishmo alo. You really shouldn't listen to that tzava. To have the young woman saying Kaddish. Yesh limcho shelo lasos kain. We should make a macha, if you will. And he goes through that in the Stei Chemed, in his piece on Avelus, that by the Sfardim, he never saw such a thing. Meaning, even though there was precedent in some of these Ashkenazic communities that there were females who said Kaddish and whatever it may be, but by Sfardim, this is, never happening.
Which I'm sure is interesting, at HANC. I'm not sure what the population was like back in his day, but I think today you have like even like, when my wife was going to HANC, not that we're the oldest people either, but there was a lot of, I think, like Persian, Sephardim from Great Neck who were there. Sure. So it's interesting. And I'm sure you probably noticed that Sephardim overall, this is a well-known thing that even if they're not as observant religiously, they're more socially conservative. So it's less of a havamina that a woman would be doing anything of this nature in the Sephardic community, which makes sense. I'm not surprised by that. So right. It seems like there's an issue kind of Migdar Milsa or Minhag of preserving our traditions, which the Chavas Yair and others bring up. And then there's kind of like the issue of Kolisha and Pritzas, of impropriety that's brought up as well. And he quotes a line here as well. I think he says, she's trying to do Kaddish in order to sanctify the name of God publicly, and hopefully it should be a benefit for her parents. But Mikshel Rabbim, instead, she's bringing a stumbling block to the Rabbim. So that's a very harsh lashon. Is there any basis that he cites to be makel, to be more flexible for a woman who's in such a difficult, challenging situation? All she wants to do is just find a way to be mezaka and honor her parents.
So right, so it's true. So toward the first half of the call it a tshuva, the piece. So he's definitely going through the reasons to be more conservative about this issue, and then he writes. He quotes Rav Henkin, who is, again, at this point off-quoted, but in 1981 or 82, whatever this is, he's quoting Rav Henkin. So he quotes Rav Henkin, who allows for a woman to say Kaddish in the Ezras Nashim while the men are saying Kaddish. And it's so interesting how he responds meaning, so he gives credence to it, meaning he's bringing it to the table, and then he writes, it's so beautiful, and this is, anyone who's read, kind of Rav Wahrman's writing. First of all, it's a very easy read for someone who knows Shas and is familiar with Shas, but it's very beautiful. He has very kind of deferential and kind of poetic language that's peppered in to anybody who's really looked at his svarim. Not that I'm like can compare it to other achronim. I'm not like a master in other achronim, but I've seen enough of Rav Wahrman's Torah to know
You
that
can right. You can feel the covenant and respect he has, it even when he's going to disagree with Rav Yosef. And he's saying, in my weak and uninformed opinion, if I may, but say that
lo
I
zachisi
have a different
lahavin,
approach.
lo zachisi lahavin.
Right.
You know, so and he brings up the whole issue of it's almost like there's an assumption here that there would be less than 10 men. He's assuming in Rav Henkin's position, as I understand it.
Well, I think he brings up in the next paragraph. He says that the issue, and this is funny because in modern Orthodox shuls you could argue the opposite. In the more traditional shuls, when there was a women's section, which wasn't always the case, it was so separated that it was
Correct.
considered a rishus b'fnei atzmo. To the
Exactly.
extent that if a man were to daven in there, they wouldn't be yotzi tefillah b'tzibor, and it's just a separate rishus altogether. Now, what's funny. And he's saying, therefore, if the woman says Kaddish, but there's no minion for her to say Kaddish, but then you can ask, but what about in a mono-Orthodox shul where there might just be like a 10 tefach mechitza? It's very much the same room.
Right.
So
Right.
that
No,
it's kind of funny that he assumes that it'd be a separate domain.
right, right. He even right he quotes a different piece of his, I forget where, from Menachem Zemba, I think he's quoting that this issue of the different rishuyos, and how that was again from his perspective is a big issue here that wouldn't allow for the woman to be able to recite Kaddish
He
in
quotes him a lot, by the way. I'm not. He
but
quotes him a
yes,
lot.
yeah.
I've never really seen him quoted as frequently anywhere else. Not to say I have like a huge bakias, but I've noticed that in Rav Warman's writings. He quotes him a lot in
I,
there.
right. I don't have a great why, but I think the only reason I know Rabbi Menachem Zemba's name is because of Rav Warman.
Right.
Uh, so, and I think in many ways that's another piece. He would often talk about, um, Gadolim, the people who write Svarim, who like, as if it was like, shaykh to us in a way that like, and it's Lahavdil, it's like, quoting the old baseball players, old basketball players. He talked about like it was just a sprach that he had as if we knew who they were. And it was only in hindsight that like, oh, Rav Shlomo Wahrman, oh, that's a name I should know. Right? Menachem Zemba, that's a name I should know. He used to talk about Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung, who also wrote one of the Haskamos, as if like, we should know who Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung from Montreal was. Like, what 11th grader like living West Hampton would like just like known who he was. But in retrospect, like we gained so much cultural literacy about the Torah world just by sitting there and listening, like, which is just like a interesting an aside.
I think
Um,
that's important. I'm sure that's probably what you hope with the rebbeim who work under you when they teach. It's not just about imparting the content and knowledge, but you want them to exude this culture of kihem chayinu v'orech and that the kids when they hear it, it's not just simply they're learning the Gemara, but they're part of a broader culture of Talmud Torah. So that sounds like something you got from Rav Warman. And
for sure.
I do want you before we conclude actually to share a little bit more about Rav Warman, but just to make sure we wrap up this piece as we're drawing toward a close. So, how does Rav Warman ultimately, for lack of a better term, paskin on this issue? What's his conclusion? What's the maskana on whether a daughter can say Kaddish for a
So,
parent?
so it's very interesting. If you just, I'll read the language. I'll try and do it quickly because I think it's worth it. Af she'offer ani tachas kapos raglav shel agon Rav Henkin zecher tzadik v'kadosh lavracha mikomakom lefi ani as daidi choshesh ani. He says, speaks so deferentially about Rav Henkin. He's worried shimnatir amiras kaddish shel banos kifio raso shel agon Rav Henkin. If that happened, shuv mizbol leis manenu. Yilamdu mizel tzarif ish l'chol davar shebekdusha. He's nervous that maybe people will learn that a woman can be mitzari for a minion for other dvarim shebekdusha. V'yomru kvar itiru prushim as hadavar. So he's nervous. He's nervous. It seems like that there's not this technical issue, but rather there's this sociological
Mm.
kind of concern. Um,
And this might actually speak to it because if you have someone who's more entrenched in what we call the more Haredi world, on the one hand, they might be more inclined to take that more machmer position because, like, what is this passage? It's passage. Like, what is this? But on the other hand, they don't have the concern necessarily that someone's then going to say, well, now women can count toward a minion. They'd understand that it's circumscribed. But perhaps this speaks to more Rav Warman's position. On the one hand, that he would even address a shaila like this because of the community he was serving, but also with his understanding of if he gave a certain psak, what the community would then do with it. They would, give an inch, take a foot. They would then run with it. And it's the classic slippery slope concern. So he's actually saying for social reasons, as a kind of like a geder, lest a woman, lest we start counting women toward minyan, they shouldn't be saying Kaddish. Now, it's probably worthwhile to do, just note to listeners, a whole separate episode specifically analyzing women in Kaddish. I think that's worthwhile. I know we're doing it very briefly just to be Mekayim Talmud Torah as we learn about Rav Warman. But yeah, what does this psak tell us about Rav Warman? And perhaps in our last 2 to 3 minutes we have together, I would love to just hear, what could any rabbis, rebbeim who are listening, gain from Rav Warman in their mahalach and their approach to teaching the next generation? And what could anyone, regardless whether they're working in Avodas HaKodesh, whether they are quote unquote a lay person, what can someone take away from Rav Warman ultimately?
So I'll try and do my best, at least from my perspective. What's interesting is, he also mentions that he brought this shaila to his rebbe Rav Silver, and Rav Silver was, concurred with him against Rav Henkin. And then what's very interesting, and I think he does this often, is, he concludes with a comment that Rav Meir Findel, who started HANC, who was a chaver of his, he calls him a chaver, he calls him much more than that, showed him a sefer from a previous Rishon Latin, Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, from his sefer Piskei Uziel. And the reason he brings it, I believe, is because ultimately what the sefer Piskei Uziel does, is, Rishon Latin Sephardi is not going to allow women to say Kaddish, is what do you do if you have this woman who so desperately wants to be mechabed her parent, and he gives eitzah in that sefer Piskei Uziel. So I think that speaks to a woman that it's not just about the technical halacha, but it's about the human experience, about the the emotion. It's about what does it mean to be a human being. And I don't think he would have been comfortable leaving off a Talmud or a person or his piece of Torah without the sensitivity of the human experience. And I think that was very much what it meant to learn by Rav Warman. You felt, it's so hard to describe. You just felt the warmth and the love. I was reminiscing with some of the rebbeim here who were also my rebbeim whenever I was here some 20 something years ago. And I reminisced, like, he used to like patch us across the face in this like old school European, but you knew even then it was love. It was zip, like all these lines that were European, but really like exuded love. And I think more importantly than the Torah that we learned with him, I think my chaver, and we've talked about this, that we recall being in the presence of someone who cared about us. So, like advice to rebbeim, to rabbanim, mechanchem. I don't know. I think these are dvarim pshutim. I think this is what, like, Rabbi Meir Findel, who hired him, and his dear friend, Rabbi Moshe Gottesman, who's the dean of HANC. It was always avas Torah and kavod abrios and loving the students. That was so axiomatic to learning Torah with Rav Warman. Those of us who knew, you know what it was like to be.
And something inspiring also, I think, is that there is this, and ein kamakam laharach, we don't have time to elaborate on this. There's almost this perception sometimes. I think this might be a distinction again between the mono-orthodox and yeshiva shevelt, that sometimes, like, being a teacher, being a quote Judaic studies teacher or a rebbe, puts you lower on the sociological totem pole. But really, it means like you weren't going to be a Rosh Yeshiva at YU or Rosh Yeshiva somewhere. But actually, he seemed to get a lot of gratification out of being able to work on the high school level with developing minds, being their rebbe for them, and making sure that they actually got exposed to a real Talmud Chacham. And I think it's something for, I'm a young guy. I have no dreams of ever being as great as Rav Warman. But, I think about like looking up to people like Rav Warman and say, why can't we strive for greatness, even if I'm not going to be the next Rosh Yeshiva of YU? Why can't we attempt to, well, again, whatever our version of Shearis Yosef that comes even somewhere close, why can't we strive to do and use him as a model for what the next generation can become?
I would say it interestingly, maybe also in a way, you never got the sense that he was using the shiur, the classroom, as a platform for him to play out his kind of grandiose expectations of what it means to share his
Mm.
Torah. It was just the experience of learning Torah with him. You never,
Lishma.
yeah. There is one anecdote. I know he had a chavrusa, and the chavrusa always liked to have a takeaway lesson. They would learn Ian, and I had heard through the grapevine that one time they were learning a sugya very in depth, and the chavrusa said, "So what's the takeaway message?" He said, "The takeaway message is that there's machlokas rishonim.
Oh,
That's the takeaway message." So he
beautiful.
was
And by the way, I relate to that a lot because I'm working in the pulpit, and many times like I'll give a shiur or something, and someone's like, "So what's like the takeaway?" I'm like, "The takeaway is that this is the sugya, and it's a great sugya, and you should know it because someone's like, but what's the inspiration?" I'm like, Talmud Torah is gufa, the inspiration. The beauty and complexity and sophistication of Torah learning is inherently an inspirational experience. So I think that's an excellent note to end on. Rabbi Slomnicki, I really want to thank you so much for your time, not only for your expertise, but your personal experience that you've been able to share with us from Rav Wahrman. I know as you gave us the caveats that there's so much more to say. It's hard to encapsulate, but it definitely gave me a deeper appreciation about Rav Wahrman, and I hope it gave our listeners a deeper appreciation. To our listeners, if you know something about Rav Wahrman or you had some personal experience or family experience that you want to share, feel free to shoot me an email, and we'd love to feature future reflections on the podcast. Thank you so much, Rabbi Slomnicki, and Hashem should bless you and your faculty to continue to carry on Rav Wahrman's Masorah at HANC.
Thank you for the opportunity to share this wonderful legacy. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.